It's the fall of 1945. World War II is over, and somewhere in a laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a 51-year-old engineer is walking past a piece of military radar equipment when he reaches into his shirt pocket for a chocolate bar. To his surprise, it's melted. He doesn't throw it away, though. He doesn't shrug and move on. He gets curious. He sends someone out for popcorn kernels, and then he holds them near the active radar tube and he waits. The popcorn kernels pop. Then, because popcorn apparently wasn't enough, he tries an egg, a raw egg, in its shell, and he placed it near the magnetron to see what happens. What happened is the egg explodes directly in his face, if you could imagine that. Percy Spencer just discovered microwave cooking. He had egg on his face, literally, and for that discovery, one of the most consequential accidental inventions in the history of technology, something that would eventually end up in 9 out of 10 American kitchens, his employer, his employer gave him a bonus, a whole $2. This is his story. To understand who Percy Spencer was, you have to understand where he came from, because where he came from was, by almost any measure, a very hard place to start. Howland, Maine. It sits in the center of the state, and it's surrounded by forest and river. In 1894, when Percy was born, it was the kind of town where most men worked with their hands, logging, farming, or working in the mills that processed their timber coming out of the North Woods. Percy's father, Jasper Spencer, died when Percy was just 18 months old. The circumstances aren't entirely clear from the historical record. Some accounts suggest illness, others imply an accident. What is clear is that the consequences were Percy's mother, Minnie, found herself a young widow with a small child and no means to support him. She made the decision that many women in her position made in that era. She sent Percy to live with relatives, in this case, his aunt and uncle. His uncle, Thomas Spencer, was a decent man by all accounts. He gave Percy a home and some stability. And then, when Percy was 7 years old, Thomas unfortunately died too. By the time Percy Spencer was old enough to be in second or third grade, he had lost not only his father, but he had been given away by his mother, and he lost his uncle. He was being raised by his aunt, a woman doing her best under extremely difficult circumstances, in a small mill town in rural Maine. At 12 years old, Percy Spencer left school. This was not unusual for boys of his era and people in his class. Formal education was a luxury at that point, and many families needed the income that a working child could produce. So Percy went to work in a spool mill, one of the factories that processed timber into the wooden spools used by the textile industry. It was hard, it was loud, it was repetitive work. There were long days on the factory floor surrounded by a lot of machinery, sawdust, and a lot of noise. The pay was modest. The future was predictable. The men who worked there tended to stay there for a really long time. It was steady employment in a place that really didn't have very many alternatives. Percy could have stayed. When he turned about 18, he heard that a paper mill in the area was planning to install electricity. This was still genuinely novel in rural Maine in the 1910s. Most of the country had electricity in its main cities, but the rural portions of it were still years away from having widespread electricity. And so for a small mill town, this was huge news. Percy had no training in electricity whatsoever. He had no textbooks, no teacher, no formal background of any kind. What he was, though, was curious. And the sudden realization that if he could learn how to wire an electrical system, he would have a skill set that almost nobody else in his town possessed. He found the three men hired to wire the mill. He went to them and asked if he could work alongside them, and not for pay, just for the learning. And they said yes. Percy Spencer taught himself electrical wiring by showing up and paying attention. After the mill electrification, he joined the United States Navy, and on this ship he encountered wireless telegraphy, the technology that would eventually become radio, and became completely obsessed with it. Spencer spent his entire time at sea reading every book on radio and wireless communication he could find. He taught himself mathematics, he taught himself physics, the engineering principles that were needed. Fellow sailors later recalled him reading technical manuals, just boring technical manuals, in his bunk late at night when others slept or they played cards. By the time he left the Navy, Percy Spencer, who had no high school diploma, no college degree, and no formal scientific training of any kind, was one of the more knowledgeable people in the country on the subject of radio wave technology. After the Navy, Spencer worked through a series of jobs in the emerging electrical industry before landing at the American Appliance Company in 1925. That company soon after would rename itself to something we know now, which is Raytheon, a name derived from Greek, roughly meaning light from the gods. And it would become one of the most important defense technology companies in American history. Spencer, he came in as a radio engineer. His self taught knowledge of radio tube design was genuinely rare, and Raytheon recognized his talent extremely quickly. Over the following 2 decades, he rose through the organization through sheer technical output. He held the kind of institutional knowledge that only comes from someone who has spent 20 years thinking about almost nothing else at this point. By the time World War II broke out, Percy Spencer was Raytheon's chief of power research. Pretty remarkable. He was 47 years old. The boy from Howland who had left school at 12 was now running the laboratory responsible for one of the most strategically critical pieces of military technology the Allies possessed. That technology was radar. The component that made military grade radar possible at the frequencies needed for precision tracking was called a magnetron. Now, a magnetron, that's a little bit different. It's a device that generates high powered microwave radiation, electromagnetic waves at very, very high frequencies, far above what ordinary radio equipment could produce. And in 1940, a team of British scientists traveled to the United States carrying what has been described as the most valuable cargo ever brought to American shores. Among the items in that package was a new type of magnetron, the cavity magnetron. Raytheon was one of the companies tasked with manufacturing magnetrons at scale, and Percy Spencer, the self taught engineer from rural Maine, was the man who figured out how to do it. When Raytheon first received the British magnetron design, they were producing approximately 17 units per day. Percy Spencer reviewed the manufacturing process and, by rethinking the whole thing from ground up, brought production to a staggering 2,600 units per day. Percy Spencer's magnetron production arguably helped win the Second World War. That's how critical it was. The radar systems those magnetrons powered protected Allied ships from German submarines. They guided the Alliance bombers to their targets, and they gave ground forces a huge early warning of enemy aircraft. He never fired a weapon. He worked in a laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but he also helped win the war. The war in Europe ended in May of 1945. The war in the Pacific ended later that year in August. I actually have an episode that's about a atomic bomb survivor, Tsutomu Yamaguchi, who actually survived both atomic bombs during the 3-day period in August that ended the war with Japan. And sometime that fall, most accounts place it late summer or early fall, Percy Spencer walked past an active magnetron in his laboratory with a chocolate bar in his shirt pocket. Was a good snack at that point in time. The details of this moment have shifted over the decades depending on who's telling the story. What every version does agree on, though, is what Percy Spencer did next. He didn't shrug, he wasn't disappointed, he didn't throw away the melted candy and move on with his afternoon. He got curious of why it melted. Spencer immediately sent out for a bag of popcorn kernels. He brought them back to the magnetron, held them near the active tube, and he waited. He waited patiently. And you know what? The kernels popped. Popcorn, the first food ever intentionally cooked by a microwave radiation. In a weapons laboratory in Massachusetts in the fall of 1945. Then Percy Spencer did something that tells you everything you need to know about his personality. Popcorn? Well, that wasn't enough. He wanted to understand the limits of what he was dealing with. So he tried an egg. He took a raw egg, still in its shell, and placed it near the magnetron to observe what would happen. What happened was the egg was heated from the inside out. Pressure built inside the shell faster than it could escape, and the egg exploded. It exploded directly in the face of the man who had just helped the war. Percy Spencer discovered microwave cooking by getting egg on his face, literally. But here's what that explosion actually told him. It told him that the magnetron was heating the moisture inside the food, causing water molecules to vibrate at an extraordinary rate. And that generated heat from the inside out, not from a flame that would do it from the outside in. And it's not from a hot surface, but from the inside. This was unlike anything that ever had existed in a kitchen. Every cooking method in human history, fires, ovens, stoves, steam, works by applying heat to the outside of food and waiting for it to travel inward. The microwave does this just the opposite. Spencer understood immediately that he was looking at something really significant. He built a metal box to contain the microwave field and concentrate the energy, and began systematically testing food after food after food. The results were consistent. The technology worked. And on October 8th, 1945, Raytheon filed a patent for a method of treating foodstuffs. The document described the core principles that still govern every microwave on the planet today. Percy Spencer had just changed cooking forever, and while he was helping the war effort. Invention is only the beginning. Getting something from this works in a laboratory to you can buy this at any store is an entirely different kind of challenge. And the path the microwave traveled from Percy Spencer's lab to your kitchen is a story in itself. The first commercial microwave was introduced by Raytheon in 1947, but it wasn't called a microwave. They called it a radar range. It was a combination of radar and range. A range is the old term for the cooking stove. The name came from a company-wide contest won by an employee named Marvin Jones. If you're picturing something roughly the size of your kitchen microwave, get that out of your mind. That was not it at all. The 1947 radar range stood approximately 6 feet tall, weighed around 750 pounds. It required its own water cooling system because the magnetron generated so much heat during the operation. And it cost $5,000. In 1947, that's a ton of money. That's the equivalent of roughly $70,000 today. So you probably wouldn't have a microwave in your kitchen if it cost $70,000. So the radar range didn't exactly fly off the shelves. It was installed in restaurants, railroad dining cars, and commercial kitchens, places that had the infrastructure and probably the budget to support it. But for the average American family, it was completely out of reach for them. Throughout the 50s, though, Raytheon worked to miniaturize and refine the technology. 1954, 7 years later, they had a version that cost between $2,000 and $3,000. Still expensive, but no longer absurd. Progress was being made, but it was being made slowly. The real breakthrough that came in 1967 when the Amana Corporation, which Raytheon had acquired, introduced a countertop radar range at $495. It was compact, it fit in a kitchen, and it was aimed directly at the American consumer. And still, adoption was slow. In 1975, 30 years after Percy Spencer's chocolate bar melted in his pocket, about 1% of American homes had a microwave oven. Only 1%. In 1986, it was about 25%. And by 1997, more than 90% of homes had a microwave. The microwave went from a 750-pound laboratory curiosity to a fixture in 9 out of 10 American kitchens within a 50-year span. That arc traces directly back to one self-taught engineer from Howland, Maine, who couldn't walk past an interesting phenomenon without stopping to fully understand why it happened. I've been saving this part for a little bit later in the story, but when Percy Spencer invented the microwave oven, when he filed that patent, when Raytheon built the radar range, when a technology worth billions of dollars was born in his laboratory, Raytheon did give him a bonus. The bonus was a meager $2. This was a standard practice at the time, though. Employee patents belonged to the company. A nominal bonus was standard as acknowledgement. $2 was not an unusual bonus. Spencer never complained about it publicly. He was, by all accounts, a man who found his reward in the work itself. He found it in solving the problems, in the thrill of discovery, and in the rare pleasure of understanding something that very few or maybe nobody had understood before. Raytheon, however, they did recognize him in other ways other than just a $2 bonus. He was awarded the Distinguished Public Service Award, one of the highest civilian honors the U.S. Navy gives. He was also named a senior vice president and a member of Raytheon's board of directors, a title that, for a man who left school at 12, is worth sitting with for a moment. But come on, $2 for the microwave oven, that invention that we all use almost every day? I find this detail both funny and quietly moving because what it says that the value of Percy Spencer created in the world, and he created an enormous amount of it, was not really something that could be accounted for in a paycheck. Percy Spencer died on September 8th, 1970, in Newton, Massachusetts. He was 76 years old. He died before the microwave became the fixture it is today. He never saw it in 9 to 10 American households, and he never saw the microwave popcorn aisle at the grocery store that we can see now that just have rows and rows of boxes of microwave popcorn, or the $10 microwave at the thrift store that nobody thinks twice about anymore. He knew what he had made. Whether he understood the full scale of what it would become, that's harder to know. What I keep coming back to is the boy in Howland, Maine, the 12-year-old who walked out of school and into a mill because his world required it and he needed the money. The teenager who showed up at the work site and asked three total strangers, think about that, to teach him something for free as an apprentice. Then he became a sailor, reading technical manuals in his bunk while everyone else slept, played cards, or enjoyed themselves. He built himself entirely, stubbornly from scratch. And what he built, it changed the world. There's a version of the story where Percy Spencer is just a trivial pursuit question. Who invented the microwave? Percy Spencer. And that's the end of it. I don't think that does him justice. The microwave is in your kitchen right now. I used it this morning to heat up some coffee after it got cold. The next time you use it, though, the reality is that it exists because a boy in rural Maine with no advantages and no safety net decided to keep paying attention to the world around him. He paid attention to the mill. He paid attention to the ship. He paid attention when the chocolate bar in his pocket melted and perhaps ruined his lunch that day. At every step, when most people would have looked the other way or moved on, Percy Spencer stopped and asked why. Well, that's the whole story, really. The magnetron and the chocolate bar are just the colorful parts of the story. The real story is much simpler. Curiosity, stubbornly maintained across a lifetime, changes things, and it changes people. Thanks for listening to another episode of Archives at Anchovies, the podcast about whatever it is I want to talk about that week. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeart, and Deezer. Until next time, I wish you a wonderful day, a great evening, and a fantastic week ahead.